Hi, this is Alex from Life at Phuket Pals. Welcome to the next GED Life Science screencast on life functions and energy intake. Our topic today is cellular respiration. So today we will talk about cellular respiration in general, about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and what this is. You might have heard this term before. If not, you will learn what it is today. We will have a look at aerobic and anaerobic respiration. What are the similarities? What are the differences between the two? And then we will have a quick look at respiration in detail. What kind of other chemical processes are involved in our body? And then we will compare photosynthesis and respiration. And after that, we will go a couple of minutes over a few questions so you can apply what you have learned in this lesson. So first, let's start with a definition. What is cellular respiration? It is a biochemical process that converts the chemical energy stored in glucose to usable energy in the form of ATP to maintain life processes in cells. As we have learned in another screencast about photosynthesis, photosynthesis is the chemical process happening in plants that produces glucose with the help of light energy from carbon dioxide and water. So plants are able to build up glucose, and glucose is a molecule that has a lot of chemical energy stored inside. Respiration is the process that gets this energy out of the glucose and makes it available to the cell in form of ATP. So let's have a look at ATP. What is ATP? ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And it's basically the energy currency of cells. So whenever the cell has to use energy, if it needs energy for a certain process, it will pay this amount of energy needed with ATP. And here we see a depiction of how we can imagine the molecule. We have an adenosine part, which is the main part of the molecule. Then we have a 5-ring sugar, and to this 5-ring sugar, the important part is attached, phosphate groups. Phosphate groups are connected to each other by fairly weak bonds that are easily broken, and when they are broken, they release a small amount of energy. So when the cell uses ATP, one phosphate group splits off. And again, we have adenosine triphosphate, so 3 phosphates, and after that we get ADP, which contains less energy. The energy comes out and can be used by the cell. ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphate groups. So adenosine triphosphate has more energy. When it is used, it changes into adenosine diphosphate, and that can be then recharged in respiration. All the energy that comes out of the glucose is transferred to many, many ATP molecules. So what is aerobic respiration? First of all, aerobic stands for air, and specifically oxygen in the air. So it is respiration that uses oxygen. The breakdown of glucose with the help of oxygen to release energy and make ATP and produce carbon dioxide and water in the process. This process mainly happens at our mitochondria in our cells. All our cells contain mitochondria to perform the steps of respiration. Here we see the word and symbol equation one more time. Aerobic respiration, breakdown of glucose with the help of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water and release the energy which will be stored in ATP molecules. Again, this is not only one ATP, we get over 30 ATP from the breakdown of one glucose molecule. We see one glucose in total needs 6 oxygen molecules to be fully oxidized, to be fully reacted and broken down into 6 carbon dioxide molecules and get all the energy out. Anaerobic respiration or fermentation is the breakdown of glucose without oxygen to release energy from it and store it in ATP. Since oxygen is not available in this case, the cells are not able to fully oxidize, to fully break down the glucose, and only a smaller amount of energy is able to be released from the glucose. And we will have a look at 2 forms of anaerobic respiration: lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation happens in mammals, for example, like us humans, in our muscles. Not only, but it can happen in our muscles. And it is a very simple equation. Glucose is broken down into lactic acid. Specifically, one glucose molecule is basically broken down in the middle into 2 lactic acid molecules. Now we can see these molecules are still fairly big, and yes, these lactic acid molecules will still contain quite a lot of energy. The problem about lactic acid is that it is toxic a little bit, so it builds up in muscles during vigorous exercise, if not enough oxygen is provided, and this causes sore muscles. So when we exercise vigorously, our muscles need to use a lot of glucose to provide enough energy for all the movement, and very often these muscles then might run out of enough oxygen, which is needed to break down the glucose in aerobic respiration. Once we run out of oxygen at the muscle, it will switch to lactic acid fermentation to still provide enough energy for the movement. And then the lactic acid accumulates in the muscle, which causes the sore muscle. Alcoholic fermentation happens in yeast, for example. It's the breakdown of glucose into ethanol and carbon dioxide. It's a bit broken down a bit more. We see we get a little bit of carbon dioxide, so we get a bit more energy out of the glucose. Now, yeast does fermentation and has several biotechnological applications. No? We will look at this in a minute. So we see once we exercise vigorously, get sore muscles, the lactic acid starts to build up because not enough oxygen can be provided to the muscles. So what happens to this lactic acid or lactate? And we see here is the muscle. The muscle, once it doesn't get enough oxygen from the blood during exercise, it will switch to lactic acid fermentation and lactate is built up. I just said that lactate contains still a lot of energy, so we don't want to waste that energy. Our body doesn't get rid of the lactate. What happens? It is given into the blood, and the blood transports the lactate around the body, and eventually it passes through the liver where it is taken up. And the liver is able to do a process called gluconeogenesis, which consumes a little bit of energy and changes the lactate back into glucose, which can then be used at a different place again, for example, at the muscle in another situation. So our body recycles the lactic acid. Why? Again, because it still contains quite a bit of energy. The applications of yeast and alcoholic fermentation are several. Saccharomyces, this is yeast. There are other organisms which are able to do alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. Here we see, for example, Aspergillus and Lactobacillus, and they are used in other biotechnological processes, for example, making cheese and yogurt. So here lactic acid is involved as well. Yeast is used to make beer, for example, to brew beer, and we make use of both the products. Alcohol, the alcohol in the beer comes from alcoholic fermentation. Yeast breaks down glucose into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The fizz in the beer comes from the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast. In wine, we only have use of the ethanol. The fizz, the carbon dioxide, will be allowed to escape. And in making bread, we only want the carbon dioxide. So when we make the dough, we add yeast, we let the dough rise. The dough rises because of the same reason. The yeast breaks down the glucose into ethanol and carbon dioxide. And while we bake the bread, the ethanol evaporates, and that's what makes our bread fluffy, all that carbon dioxide, all these tiny bubbles in the dough. Okay, let's have a look at cellular respiration a bit more in detail. So earlier we said cellular respiration, okay, aerobic respiration, we have glucose and we add 6 oxygen molecules, and out comes 6 carbon dioxide molecules, water, and quite a few ATP molecules for the cell to use. Well, it's not that easy. That's not really what happens in our cells. We will not go over this in detail. I just want you to know that there are many steps involved to release that energy step by step in our cells. So glucose comes into the cell, and in the cytoplasm, glucose is broken down into 2 smaller molecules, 2 pyruvate molecules, which is half a glucose basically, that releases a little bit of energy. The step is called glycolysis. If we don't have enough oxygen available, then we go into lactic acid fermentation here. That happens in the cytoplasm as well. If oxygen is present, these 2 pyruvate molecules go into our mitochondria, and this is where most of the energy is released in very complex steps of reaction, the so-called Krebs cycle, which we see here. Citric acid cycle is the same thing. So we see that the molecules, the pyruvate molecules, come into the mitochondria, and we have many steps involved here. All these steps are controlled by enzymes, and slowly the energy will be released from the glucose until it is completely oxidized into 6 carbon dioxide molecules. You don't need to know all these steps. I just want you to see that it is much more complex what is happening in our body than just a simple chemical equation. Okay, the last thing, to revise photosynthesis a little bit. Let's have a look at the connection between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That is very important to understand. Plants do photosynthesis to make their own food. So they take carbon dioxide and water molecules, and they use the energy of the sunlight to produce glucose. Again, this is not such a simple chemical reaction in the plant as well. There are many enzyme control steps involved until a glucose molecule is finally completed. So the energy from the sun goes into the glucose molecule, is now stored in the form of chemical energy, and now living things can break down the glucose with the help of oxygen, and the opposite reaction, breakdown of glucose with the help of oxygen, is then aerobic respiration, and we get carbon dioxide and water again. So the reactions look exactly the same. The only difference is they go into opposite directions. Another thing that is important to mention here is that plants do both. Plants do photosynthesis to make their own food, and they use their own food by breaking it down via cellular respiration. So here we see the relation again. Cellular respiration happens at the mitochondria. Glucose goes in and oxygen goes in. The mitochondria release the energy, ATP is made, and carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product, and water. These substances then can be used by plants in the chloroplasts. Carbon dioxide and water combine. Light energy is given in to build up the chemical bonds and make a glucose molecule again that contains chemical energy. Again, this can happen in the same cell. Plant cells do both photosynthesis and respiration. Okay, as a summary, what have we learned? Cellular respiration is the process in which cells break down glucose, release the stored energy, and use it to make ATP, the energy currency of cells. The process begins in the cytoplasm and is completed in the mitochondria. Some organisms can produce ATP from glucose anaerobically. One way is by fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, or lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation, for example, in our muscles, alcoholic fermentation done by the microorganism yeast. The products of cellular respiration are needed for photosynthesis and vice versa. Together, the two processes store and release energy in virtually all living things. Okay, it's time for some practice and questions. Question 1. When does respiration take place in animals and plants? A. All the time in animals, all the time in plants. B. All the time in animals, nighttime only in plants. Daytime only in animals, daytime only in plants. Or D. Daytime only in animals, nighttime only in plants. I give you some seconds to think about this. Okay, the correct answer here is A. Animals need energy all the time to stay alive. Our cells, same as plant cells. Plant cells need to do respiration all the time to stay alive. Now, the only difference is during daytime, plants usually cover up this effect of respiration by doing a lot more photosynthesis, so they produce oxygen, but at the same time they will do some respiration. Determine whether the process is respiration or fermentation and write the correct response in the blank. With respiration here we mean aerobic respiration, fermentation anaerobic respiration. A. Provides a lot of energy. B. Needs oxygen. C. Provides a little energy. D. Does not require oxygen. Alright, I give you some seconds to think about this. Okay, as you probably said correctly, the first two are cellular or aerobic respiration, provides a lot of energy, again, fully oxidizing the glucose with the help of oxygen to 6 carbon dioxide that releases all the energy stored in glucose. Fermentation provides only a little energy, does not need oxygen, but the products, alcohol or lactic acid, still contain quite an amount of energy that did not get released here. Okay, question 3. What is produced by anaerobic respiration in yeast? Lactic acid, carbon dioxide. I give you some seconds to think. Okay, the correct answer here is C. Anaerobic respiration in yeast produces ethanol or alcohol and carbon dioxide. Lactic acid is anaerobic respiration. In mammals, lactic acid fermentation. Question number 4. What is the word equation for aerobic respiration in plants? I give you some seconds to think. Yes, the correct answer is C. Glucose plus oxygen gives carbon dioxide and water. Again, aerobic respiration is the same in all living things, plants and animals. Question 5. Which description of anaerobic respiration in yeast is correct? It produces alcohol, yes or no? It releases more energy than aerobic respiration, yes or no? Take your time. Yes, the correct answer is C. Anaerobic respiration in yeast is alcoholic fermentation, so yes, it produces alcohol. It releases more energy than aerobic respiration. No, aerobic respiration releases the most amount of energy possible from the glucose. The diagram shows an experiment to investigate gas exchange in a leaf. What we see here is we see a leaf in a test tube that is closed, only is connected to the outside via this small glass tube, and in that glass tube is an ink drop that closes the glass tube off. That ink drop can move around. The test tube is covered with a black cover, so no light comes to the leaf. And at the bottom of the test tube we have a substance to absorb carbon dioxide. The substance will bind carbon dioxide and take it out of the air. In which direction does the ink drop move, and for what reason? Take your time for this question. If you're not sure yet, you can pause the video and think a little bit longer. I will give you the answer now. The correct answer is B. The ink drop will move to the left, and the reason is respiration. Again, since we have a black cover, no photosynthesis is happening, but the cells in the leaf are still alive, so they will still conduct respiration, which means oxygen is taken up from the air, oxygen is removed from the air to help break down the glucose, and carbon dioxide is released into the air in the test tube. However, we have a substance that absorbs carbon dioxide and takes it immediately out of the air again. So the change that we will see is oxygen molecules are taken out, and that causes the pressure in our test tube to slightly decrease, and the ink drop will move towards the left to equalize that drop in pressure. And the reason for that is the cells still respire. Question number 7. The list shows 4 metabolic processes. Carbon dioxide plus water gives glucose plus oxygen. 2, glucose gives alcohol plus carbon dioxide. 3, glucose gives lactic acid. 4, glucose plus oxygen gives carbon dioxide plus water. Which of these processes occur in muscles? Take your time. Okay, the correct answer is C, 3 and 4. Glucose to lactic acid fermentation in our muscles that happens during vigorous exercise when oxygen can't be supplied in enough quantity to the muscle, so it needs to switch to lactic acid fermentation. And if there is enough oxygen present in the muscle, it will conduct, as usual, aerobic respiration. Number 2 is alcoholic fermentation. We are not able to conduct this, we are not able to do this. This happens in yeast. And the first equation is the opposite of respiration, photosynthesis. Question 8. The diagram shows an experiment to investigate the respiration of yeast. We see the experiment at the beginning. We have a solution containing yeast and sugar, and we have a deflated balloon on top of the reaction vessel. After 24 hours, we still have some yeast and sugar in the solution, containing a new compound now, and gas has evolved. Which gas is evolved, and which new compound is present after 24 hours? Take your time. The correct answer is A. Carbon dioxide is evolved and ethanol or alcohol is produced. Again, we have yeast, alcoholic fermentation, changing glucose into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Since the gas is not able to escape, the pressure in our closed system increases and the balloon starts to inflate. Why does anaerobic respiration in muscles release less energy than aerobic respiration? Have a look at the answers and take your time. Okay, the correct answer is energy remains trapped in lactic acid. Yes, we are again at the muscle, so we have lactic acid fermentation, and as we said earlier, not all the energy is able to be released from the glucose. A lot of energy will remain inside the lactic acid molecules. This is why our body does not get rid of the lactic acid but brings it back to the liver for the liver to make gluconeogenesis to recycle the lactic acid back into glucose. And our last question, question 10. We have a graph here. The graph shows the energy released by two animals through respiration as the external temperature changes. So on our y-axis, we see the rate of energy released, basically the rate of respiration. And in the x-axis, we see the external temperature, the temperature the organism is surrounded by. Which conclusion can be drawn from the graph? Take your time here. Okay, if you are not sure yet, you can pause the video and continue to think about your answer. I will tell you the answer now. Correct answer is D. The rate of respiration is the same for both animals at 23 degrees Celsius. If we look at 23 degrees Celsius and we follow that line, we see that the two lines cross, which means we are at the same rate of energy release, the same rate of respiration. Okay, so thank you very much for joining this podcast on life functions and energy intake, the topic cellular respiration. That's all from me, Alex, from Live at Phuket Pulse. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.